Capricorn. What if the most important thing that happens in 2026 is something you've already seen, but failed to recognize, not because you missed it, not because you weren't paying attention, because when it first appeared, it didn't seem important. And that's exactly what makes this year so dangerous, because the truth rarely arrives looking like the truth. Sometimes it arrives as a memory, sometimes it arrives as a coincidence. Sometimes it arrives as a person you haven't thought about in years. And sometimes it arrives as a feeling you cannot explain, a feeling that refuses to leave. Maybe you've already experienced it. Maybe you were scrolling through your phone late at night and suddenly stopped, not because of a message. Not because of a notification. Because a certain name crossed your mind for no reason, a name you weren't thinking about, a name connected to a chapter you believed was over. And yet, there it was. Or maybe something stranger happened. You walked into a room, you looked at an object you've seen hundreds of times before, and suddenly remembered a conversation from years ago. Not the entire conversation, just one sentence, one detail, one moment. A moment that didn't seem important back then, but now it feels different. And Capricorn. That is where this story begins. Not with answers. With moments like these, small moments, strange moments, moments most people ignore. But one thing Capricorn doesn't realize yet, those moments are connected. We'll come back to that. Because there is another pattern appearing, and once you notice it, you won't be able to stop seeing it. People are behaving differently, not dramatically. Subtly. Someone who used to respond immediately now takes hours. Someone who used to seem interested suddenly feels distant. Someone who never had an opinion suddenly has many. Someone who always seemed confident suddenly appears uncertain. At first you dismiss it. Everyone changes. Everyone has bad days. Everyone gets busy. But then something happens. The same feeling returns. Again. And again. And again. The feeling that something important is happening beneath the surface. And the strangest part, you cannot explain why. There is no evidence. No proof, nothing concrete. Just intuition. And that is unusual for you, because you trust facts. You trust reality. You trust what can be measured. Which is why what happens next becomes impossible to ignore. You begin noticing repetition, not events. Patterns. You hear the same message from different people. You encounter the same lesson in different situations. You keep finding yourself in conversations that somehow lead to the exact same topic. And for some reason, the past keeps appearing, not all of it, just specific pieces, specific faces, specific memories, specific moments. As if something is trying to direct your attention somewhere. But where? That is the question, and the answer is not what most people think. Because this is not really about the past. At least not in the way you imagine. There is one mistake Capricorn has been repeating for years. A mistake so subtle that most Capricorns never recognize it. We're going to come back to that later. For now, pay attention to something else. The timing. Because timing becomes strangely important in 2026. You think about someone, and they appear. You remember a place, and somehow end up there. You consider a possibility, and suddenly life places it directly in front of you. Coincidence, maybe, but after the 5th time, the 6th time, the 10th time, you start wondering. And once you start wondering, you start watching. And once you start watching, you begin seeing things that were always there. The part nobody expects is that none of these signs provide immediate answers. They create questions. More questions than ever, questions that follow you into quiet moments. Questions that return while you're driving. Questions that appear just before you fall asleep. Why now? Why this memory? Why this person? Why this feeling? Why? Does it seem like life keeps pointing at something without telling you what it is, Capricorn? There is a reason, a very important reason. But you're not supposed to see it yet. Because before the answer arrives, something else must happen first, and that something has already begun. And that realization leaves you with an uncomfortable question. What exactly have you been sensing all this time? Because the more attention you pay, the stranger certain things become. Maybe you noticed it in a conversation. Not what someone said, what they didn't say, the pause. The hesitation, The subject they quickly changed. At the time it seemed insignificant. Now you're not so sure, or maybe it happened differently. Maybe you sent a message. Nothing emotional. Nothing dramatic. Just a normal message. And for some reason. You found yourself checking your phone more often than usual. Not because you needed an answer. Because something about the silence felt important. You couldn't explain why. But it stayed with you. And Capricorn, those moments have been happening more often lately. Small moments, ordinary moments, yet somehow they refuse to leave your mind. The strange part is not that they happened. The strange part is that they keep returning. We'll come back to that. Because there is another pattern emerging, one that most people would completely miss. You start hearing the same lesson from different sources. A stranger says something. A friend repeats something similar. Then a video. Then a book. Then another conversation. Different words? The same message. At first you ignore it, then you notice it. Then you start wondering, why does this keep happening, and what is it trying to show you? That question becomes important later. For now. Pay attention to something else. The people. Because people become unusually revealing during this period. Not because they suddenly change. Because you start noticing details you overlooked before. Maybe someone still calls you, still texts you. Still shows up, but something feels different. Not wrong. Different. Maybe you realize they remember the stories that matter to them, but somehow forget the stories that matter to you. Maybe they still ask questions, but never seem interested in the answers. Maybe they still say all the right things, yet you leave every conversation feeling strangely unseen. Not hurt, not angry. Just unseen, and you can't quite explain why. But that's not the most interesting part. The most interesting part is what happens when you stop chasing. Maybe you were always the first person to reach out, the first to check in, the first to start the conversation. Then one day, you didn't. A few days passed, then a week. Then longer. And suddenly you learned something you were never trying to discover. We'll return to that later, because another question appears. Why do certain chapters still have power over you? Not all chapters. Specific ones, specific memories, specific people, specific moments. Maybe you haven't thought about them for months. Then something small triggers them. A song, a street, a photograph, a random Tuesday afternoon. And suddenly you're remembering details you thought were gone forever. Not the entire memory. Just pieces. The look on someone's face, something left unsaid, a feeling, a moment. And for some reason, those fragments refuse to disappear. The strange part is not that the chapter ended. The strange part is why it still has power over you. We'll come back to that. Because there is one detail you've been ignoring. A very small detail. So small that most Capricorns never notice it, yet it explains more than you realize. Not yet. Later. For now. There is something else happening. You are becoming more aware of your own reactions. More aware of what drains you. More aware of what energizes you. More aware of the conversations you replay afterward. More aware of the people who leave you feeling lighter. And the people who leave you feeling heavier. You haven't figured out why yet. But the difference is becoming impossible to ignore. And this is where things begin getting uncomfortable. Because some of the answers you're searching for may be hiding in places you've stopped looking. Not because they're hidden, because they became familiar. And familiar things are easy to overlook. Especially for Capricorn. Especially when you've spent years focusing on responsibility. Work. Obligations. Goals. Survival. There is one mistake many Capricorns repeat without realizing it, a mistake connected to loyalty, a mistake connected to time, a mistake connected to someone you may not even be thinking about right now. We'll come back to that later, because before the truth reveals itself, one final pattern needs to become visible. And once you see it. Everything starts changing. But understanding does not arrive gently. Not this time, because before clarity comes, something else appears first. Resistance. And Capricorn. This is the part nobody talks about. Because there are moments when reality tries to show you something, and you immediately look away, not intentionally, not consciously. Instinctively. Maybe because part of you already knows what you'll find. Maybe because some questions are easier to carry than answers. And that is where 2026 becomes unusual. Because certain questions refuse to disappear. A memory returns. Then disappears, then returns again. A face crosses your mind, then vanishes. Then appears again weeks later. At first it feels random. Then it feels strange. Then it starts feeling intentional. There is one memory that keeps returning. Not because it's important. At least that's what you've been telling yourself. We'll come back to it, because something else starts happening. You begin noticing small inconsistencies, not dramatic ones. Tiny ones. The kind most people ignore. Maybe someone tells you they care, and yet somehow they never ask how you're doing. Maybe someone says they support you, yet they disappear when things become difficult. Maybe someone remembers every detail about their own life, but somehow forgets the details that matter to yours. None of these things seem significant alone, but together, they create a feeling you cannot quite explain. And Capricorn, you've been trying to explain it for a long time. Maybe longer than you realize, because there is one conversation you still remember. Not because of what was said, because of what wasn't. A pause, a hesitation, a sentence that never came. We'll come back to that later, because strangely enough, that missing sentence matters more than you think, and it isn't the only thing returning. Certain situations feel familiar, uncomfortably familiar. Different people, different places, different years, yet somehow the emotional feeling remains the same. Have you noticed that? The same disappointment wearing different faces, the same confusion arriving through different circumstances, the same question appearing again and again. As if life keeps pointing towards something, without telling you what it is. At least not yet. And this is where many Capricorns become frustrated. Because you like solving problems, you like reaching conclusions, you like understanding how things work. But what happens when the answer refuses to arrive? What happens when all you have are clues? Because that is exactly what 2026 begins placing in front of you. Clues. Small ones, subtle ones, easy to dismiss, difficult to forget. Maybe you stop reaching out first. Just once, just to see what happens. And what happens surprises you. Maybe someone you've heard from every week suddenly disappears. Maybe someone you assumed would notice. DOES and single quotes T. Maybe the silence tells you something words never could. We'll come back to that. Because another detail becomes important later. The timing. The timing of certain memories. The timing of certain encounters. The timing of certain realizations. For some reason, things begin returning exactly when you've stopped thinking about them. Not before, not after, exactly then. And that pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The strange part is that none of this gives you answers. If anything, it creates more questions. Questions about people. Questions about choices. Questions about chapters you thought were finished. Because there is likely something in your life that ended a long time ago, yet somehow still occupies space inside your mind. Not every day. Not constantly, just enough. Enough to remind you it still exists. The strange part is not that it ended. The strange part is why it still matters. We'll come back to that, because hidden inside that question. Is another question, a much bigger one. A question that changes everything once you finally ask it. But you're not ready for that question yet. Not quite. First, one more pattern needs to reveal itself, and once it does, you'll never see your past the same way again. And this is where the transformation begins. Not with a miracle. Not with a dramatic announcement. Not with someone finally giving you the answer you thought you needed. In fact, the strangest part is that the answer may never come. That message you waited for. That conversation you replayed 100 times. That explanation you thought would change everything. It may never arrive. In Capricorn, for most of your life, that would have felt unbearable. Because Capricorn rarely asks for help. Even when exhausted. Especially when exhausted, Capricorn would rather carry 10 extra burdens than admit one burden has become too heavy. Capricorn would rather solve the problem alone than risk becoming the problem. And for years, that part of you kept moving forward. It kept working. It kept building. It kept surviving. Even when something inside you was still waiting. Waiting for closure. Waiting for understanding. Waiting for one final piece of the puzzle. But something changes during 2026, not outside you, inside you. Maybe one night you find an old message, A message you haven't looked at in years. Maybe you read it again. Maybe you don single quotes T. And suddenly you realize something strange. The message itself was never what mattered. It was the meaning you attached to it. Maybe a song comes on unexpectedly. The same song. The one that instantly takes you back to a specific moment, a specific person, a specific version of yourself. And for a second, the memory returns. But this time something is different. You notice it immediately. The memory is still there. The emotion is not, or at least not in the same way, because the memory no longer owns you, and that is where everything begins changing. Not when the memory disappears. When its power does. There will still be days when a name crosses your mind. Days when an old photograph appears. Days when you remember a conversation you thought you had forgotten. Remember that conversation, the one that kept returning throughout this story. The one you never completely understood. The strange truth is that it was never about what was said. It was about what you spent years trying to hear. And suddenly, you stop listening for it. You stop checking whether they noticed. You stop wondering what they meant. You stop replaying the silence. You stop trying to solve a chapter that ended long ago. And the strangest part, you won't even remember exactly when it stopped hurting. One day you will simply notice that it has. Because Capricorn, healing rarely happens all at once. It happens quietly. The same way mountains change. Slowly. Patiently. Almost invisibly. Until one day the entire landscape is different. And maybe that is the lesson. Not that the past was meaningless. Not that the people were meaningless. Not that the experience was meaningless. The lesson is that your life was never supposed to stop there. Your story was never supposed to end in that conversation, that disappointment, that loss, that silence. Capricorn. You have spent so much of your life carrying responsibility that you forgot something important. You were never meant to carry everything. Not every burden, not every relationship, not every outcome, not every person's expectations. And as that realization settles into your heart, something finally relaxes. Not your ambition, not your strength, not your determination. The weight you've been carrying for years. The weight nobody knew existed. The weight you stopped noticing because it became part of you. And for the first time in a very long time, you set it down. Not because someone helped you. Because you finally realized it was never yours to carry. And as 2026 comes to a close, you may look back and understand something that once seemed impossible. The thing you thought you needed most was never the answer. It was freedom from needing the answer. Maybe peace isn't finally getting the explanation. Maybe peace is no longer needing it. Maybe peace is reading the old message and smiling instead of hurting. Maybe peace is hearing the song and staying present instead of returning to the past. Maybe peace is remembering without reliving, and that changes everything. Because the greatest discovery of 2026 is not who betrayed you, not who left, not who failed to understand you. The greatest discovery is realizing that your future was never trapped inside those questions. It was waiting beyond them. Waiting for the moment Capricorn finally stopped carrying yesterday and started walking toward tomorrow. And one day, when you look back on this year, you may realize that the moment you finally saw the truth was also the moment you finally put down the weight you were never meant to carry, and that was the moment your real life began.